This is an analysis of the poem by Thomas Hardy called Neutral Tones. And what we're going to look at today is a little bit of context, a little bit of close reading of this poem and how you can write about it, especially if you're studying it or wanting to analyse it in writing. So I'm going to assume that you've read the poem and you've got a copy of it. You can get a clean copy online. I think just Googling it will give you several different options. But just read through it and have your own thoughts about exactly what it could be about and what we're talking about. So as ever, you might want to start by going in with the title, establishing what the narrative line of the poem is, what the plot line, if you like, would be, and then to start thinking about those connotations, those ideas, allusions, references, ambiguities that Hardy might be bringing into his work. So once you've had a look at that, if we kind of go on to the next page, make it bigger, I'd start by looking at the title. So we know sort of straight away that we've got neutral kind of meaning in the middle, kind of meaning non-committed. Okay, so not extreme. So we want to kind of comment on that meaning. Okay, that idea of not being kind of an extreme of emotion or extreme of view. Also, this idea of tone can be sound, can be colour, can be voice. Okay, and so if we get the together neutral tones, we're expecting something which is kind of in the middle, right? You can also kind of go to neutral as being something more bland, something, less provoking, I guess. And if you're talking to somebody in neutral tones, you might be sounding kind of flat or disinterested. You might be sounding kind of calm and measured. But one way or another, we've got the expectation established by this title that really this is going to be a sort of objective voice, maybe sort of neutral. And we look at the first stanza, and the first thing that kind of hits me anyways is the pronoun we, because it immediately lets you know that the first person speaker of this dramatic monologue isn't alone at the time he's thinking of. We stood, so we're in the past tense, and we stood by a pond that winter day. Now you've got this largely monosyllabic, and I'm saying largely because you've got winter, and so it's generally in simple language. Okay, largely monosyllabic, one syllabic relating to syllables. So straightforward, plain, recounting sort of factually, if you like. But there are a couple of things, or in fact 3 things I'd say in this opening line that give us a clue in terms of what Hardy's going to do with the rest of the piece. Because we've got these people standing still, they're not moving, and that idea of lack of movement is going to be significant. We've got the idea of winter and all of the connotations of kind of things ending, things hibernating, maybe things dying off, harshness, coldness, maybe emotional coldness, if we're thinking sort of pathetic fallacy-wise. Pathetic fallacy, kind of weather setting, mimicking emotions. And we've also got the pond, which is a body of water. If we think of rivers being significant in terms of their progress, their travelling, their flow, if we think of seas being tides, ebb and flow, ponds kind of stay there. They are at best static, so still, and at worst stagnant. And stagnant is that kind of nastiness you get to water, where it's kind of a little bit fetid, it's got kind of horrible leaves in it, it smells a bit because it's been still. So straight away, we've established the tone from a line which is to do with inertia. Okay, inertia is not moving, and sort of lethargy or being passive. And the sun was white as though chidden of God. So we also then get this idea of the colour having been drained out of things. And when you get white, you can go down all sorts of different stages for connotations with it. But here I think we're kind of, having had the colour sucked out of it rather than anything else. Because we end up with this simile here, as though chidden of God. And if you've read any 19th century, any 19th century novels, you will remember that a chiding is a telling off, okay, to be reprimanded by, rebuked or scolded. So the sun looks like it's white, as if it's been told off by God, and a few leaves lay on the starving sod. So this idea, starving sod. Sod is earth which has got kind of grass attached to it, like a clump of earth with grass. So here we've got the earth personified because it is hungry, and all of the connections of hunger and need and being deprived and malnourished. Okay, and it's kind of inverting the trope, a trope being that kind of regular picture, image or idea you get, inverting the trope of that kind of generous Mother Earth, looking after everybody. Instead, this earth is starving. Say they had fallen from an ash and were grey. Now, a lot of the time, our brains, when we go to ash, we think of fire ash. And that's actually the secondary meaning here, because these leaves have fallen from an ash, and an ash is a type of tree. So number one, we've got the tree. So we've got, again, this seasonal imagery that things have fallen and died. Autumn has happened. The leaves are already on the floor. We're definitely in winter. We've got the greyness complementing, adding to the lack of colour of the sun. Again, tying into this idea of neutral tones. But also where your brain went first of all, in terms of the ash being the embers of something. So it's burnt out, kind of remnants, what's left. And very quickly we're going to put together that this ash reference can also kind of contain an allusion to the end of this relationship. This is a relationship, this is a passion that has also burned out. It is no more. So we're very much kind of within the language of melancholy. So sadness, that extreme sadness. The colours are all kind of to do with that idea of things being bleak, things of being lifeless. And, there being a kind of atmosphere and environment of hostility. There being kind of this idea of things having died, things having kind of been deprived of all energy. And we start to kind of understand that there is this relationship between how the speaker sees his world, his perception of what's happening, and what's happened or how he's feeling. So he's using the natural imagery really to kind of echo or mirror or mimic his own disappointment in life. We get this next stanza where the focus turns to the person he's with, and we're going to assume that this is the then lover, soon to be ex-lover. And the speaker addresses her directly and remembers that she was looking at him as if he was a puzzle, a riddle that became kind of boring or tiresome from some time back. So your eyes on me, so you were looking at me as if you were looking at, as eyes that travel, rove, over tedious, over dull, or no longer kind of interesting puzzles of years ago. So on a more kind of paraphrasing level, we're saying, okay, you were looking at me as if I was a puzzle you could no longer be, as if I was an old puzzle you could no longer be bothered solving. But we also have something more interesting going on to do with the enjambment, to do with the kind of connotations of this word rove, because you might remember cartoon dogs being called Rover. To rove means to kind of travel widely and freely. So first of all, you get the impression that she's looking anywhere else other than him, or that she's kind of looking all over him as if she really can't work him out. But the connotations of roving eyes also relate to the idea that somebody is constantly on the lookout for a new or better partner. So if you were to hear from somebody, oh, her new boyfriend's all right, but he's got a roving eye, it means that, you can't quite trust him. He's always on the lookout for a better option. And the fact that Hardy leaves the word rove on the end of that line, we know it's enjambed, so it carries on in the sense to hear. But this rove is isolated, draws attention to its movement and draws attention to the fact that it's eyes that rove. And a roving eye is a reason for an end to a relationship. So we're not told explicitly that, she might be looking around for better options. But we do start to think that maybe that might be part of it, that kind of indirect reference, that allusion. And the idea of riddles or kind of tedious riddles, a riddle is there to interest, a riddle is there to be solved. So their relationship has kind of become oxymoronic. It's now, there's this puzzle that nobody's going to solve, nobody can be bothered solving. And the idea of this kind of status of their relationship is picked up in the word choice in the final two lines here of this stanza. Some words played between us to and fro. Okay, so it's almost like they're not taking this seriously. They're just going backwards and forwards. There's this sense that they're just going through the motions now, right? It's not meaningful. It's some words, we're at it again. And the thing they're arguing about is who is worse off as a result of their relationship. So, what should be mutually supportive has now turned into being kind of tediously competitive, almost. And then he moves from the focus of her general to thinking about her smile. And I really do like this image because he says, the smile on your mouth was the deadest thing, alive enough to have strength to die. So he's looking at her and saying her smile seems dead. And it's not just dead, it's the deadest thing. It's this superlative. And it's an object, it's a thing. It's no longer a kind of human emotion. There's this kind of disassociation between happiness and what she's doing with her face. And even then, the smile, even though it's the deadest thing, is alive enough to have strength to die. Now, I think the best way I can describe of this is if you do a really fake grin and then just do a really massively dull, disinterested face. Okay, imagine somebody you really can't stand is looking at you and you're giving them the fakest smile in the world, and then you want them to know, just as they're looking away, that you're not even impressed with that, so you completely let the smile drop from your face. It's that kind of idea. Okay, it's completely dismissive and completely kind of, rude and awful and upsetting, because, it's no longer the emotion that it was meant to be. So it's kind of oxymoronic. It's meant to express happiness and it doesn't. It expresses negativity. It is dead and alive simultaneously, kind of like their relationship at that moment. It hasn't yet finished, but my goodness, it's going to in the very near future. And the grin of bitterness, this kind of bitter smile sweeps over like an ominous means kind of bad things are on their way. Bird a wing, and a bird a wing is a flying bird. Okay, so this kind of bitterness sweeps across her face like a bad luck bird is passing. And there's a long kind of literary association of birds with death and birds with bad luck, especially kind of birds that are black. You think of Macbeth, the raven on the battlements. But you've got this kind of, all the natural imagery, if you like, is being twisted. That kind of thing of the bird, the living things are being twisted to represent his perception of everything is going wrong, right? You've then got this ellipsis, and it's like he's kind of being lost in the memory, or that he's going through, he loses himself in that pain again, or the image. So we've had, the kind of natural world being sucked of life and drained of life. We've had her and the speaker kind of treating the relationship like a pointless, boring game. the idea that there is a contradiction there, this emotion is now fake rather than real. And then we get this temporal jump, we get this kind of timing shift, because the first three stanzas were then, this is now. And we realise that he's reflecting on everything that's happened since. And he's no longer kind of standing by a pond that winter day, but he thinks that since that time, since the incident we're talking about, keen lessons that love deceives and rings with wrongs have shaped to me your face. I mean, that's a really awful thing to say to somebody, that since then, everything I've been taught, that you can't trust love and that it'll kind of wring you out, it'll ruin you with the wrong of it. They create to me the memory of your face, right? It takes me right back to that moment. And we know things have got worse as far as he's concerned in the intervening time, because the son is now God cursed. It's no longer been chidden by God, it's now been cursed by God. So there's the kind of escalation of that kind of idea. And he's straight back to the tree, the pond, the greyish leaves. So structure-wise, it's cyclical. He hasn't moved on. He just keeps returning to that idea, just like the pond. He's kind of still, he's stagnant rather than static. He's still stuck in his kind of decaying landscape emotionally. But it's also interesting kind of what he's doing with this line, this idea of keen, because keen, yes, we know that it means sort of enthusiastic, eager. So, kind of intense, we can read it as here. But keen is also a word you'd use to mean sharp. You can say a keen blade. So the idea that, it's painful. But also the verb to keen is that kind of noise that you hear people make when they're making that awful kind of crying, whimpering, wailing expression of sorrow. It's a really instinctive and sound of grief, right? So it carries on wrapping up all of those images, all of those connotations, because he knows that love deceives. And the personification of love, you can't trust love, it will trick you. It's almost like he's distinguishing love as something she has tainted, like a separate thing that she has now turned against him. And the rings with wrong, it's that kind of internal half rhyme. You get ideas of wringing out something, to kind of really squeeze every last drop of moisture out of it, like the environment. But also you wring your hands when you're grieving. It's that idea of moving your hands backwards and forwards. So you might also, I think, one student suggested to me in a moment of great kind of insight, that rings, it could also relate to wedding rings, that rings with wrong are kind of relationships. You can't trust them. But there's a whole lot idea, everything comes together, and it always brings him back to this moment of breaking up. So all in all, you've got a poem that kind of is cyclical, doesn't move on, is using natural imagery, but not for this kind of celebration of life, but for this kind of end of life idea, or end of life of this relationship. And you've also got the form and structure to think about. So it's kind of generally made up of some iambic tetrameter, but there's some irregularity in it. There's some iambs, there's some anapaests. If you're really kind of into the metrical form, if you like that kind of side of things, I'd have a look at some of the advice that's given on a website called crossrefit.com. If you go to the How Poetry Works and metrical verse there, you'll find definitions of all these points. But we've got kind of anapaests that slow the pace. We've got monosyllables there. But we've also got an ABBA sort of rhyme scheme. It's this thing that I've heard referred to as envelope rhyme. And it's almost like each stanza is kind of bundled up in the way that he can't escape this memory. He can't escape each of these stanzas, each of these ideas. It all kind of closes up and closes off. So you really do have the idea that, this is a massive event in his life that he hasn't been able to move on from. If you're looking at context for the poem, obviously we've got, normally literary context that nature very often celebrates a relationship, whereas this really doesn't. You've got the idea of literary form-wise, looking at her mouth, looking at her eyes, etc. That praising or listing to praise parts of a woman's body would normally be called the blazon, from the blazon tradition. That kind of turns it round, that it inverts that tradition. You expect, you're listing the parts of a woman to say how beautiful they are. He's saying how awful they are. But Hardy's poetry generally tends to be kind of put in the natural world, tends to be also kind of have this pessimism about it, also have this kind of bleakness and this sense of melancholy. Depending on which or why you're studying this poem or which exam board you're studying it for, your context will kind of come in for different percentages. But, do remember kind of a little bit of Hardy context, but also a little bit of literary context, like the blazon, like the kind of, bad luck birds, as it were. Hopefully that helps you with this poem. I hope so, and good luck. Bye now.